Nosferatu descended from Dracula's castle and onto your Super NES back in 1995. Developed and published by Seta Corporation, Nosferatu was definitely one of their more ambitious games up to this point. And if you're scratching your head as to who or what Seta Corp actually is, well, the only other game you've probably ever heard of them developing was the woefully terrible Wizard of Oz game for the Super NES, with the rest of their lineup mostly consisting of Japan-only releases and a bunch of Mahjong games. So when screenshots of Nosferatu started hitting Western magazines, it definitely caused a few people to take notice with its super detailed and dark-looking take on the classic Dracula story. Well, it would have caused people to take notice had the Sony PlayStation not launched just a few weeks before Nosferatu released here in the West, effectively making it DOA as soon as it hit store shelves. But just because most everyone missed out on it back then doesn't mean we have to miss out on it today. So is Nosferatu still worth hunting down? Or would you be better off playing that Wizard of Oz game? Well, grab your favorite hammer and steak, because we're about to see if Nosferatu should rise from its grave. Start up Nosferatu and you're greeted to some really nice cutscenes telling the story. Basically, if you've ever heard of how Dracula goes about his business, then you already know that he's come down from his castle and kidnapped a girl to become his dark bride of the night. But it just so happens that Kyle, the girl's boyfriend, isn't having any of that nonsense and heads off to Dracula's castle to save her. Definitely pretty standard stuff here as far as a game featuring Dracula, but what stands out here are the gorgeous rotoscoped cutscenes that show up throughout the game. There's not a ton, but the animation quality here is top notch and really goes a long way in setting the mood and atmosphere for the game. Even little touches like how Kyle here briefly pauses before he runs into the castle goes a long way in showing character without actually saying anything. Once you're done admiring the cutscenes, then go ahead and press the start button to get on the path to finding Dracula and saving your girlfriend. Once you're brave enough to get into the game, playing Nosferatu can be just as scary as the nightmarish creatures roaming its hallways. If you've ever played a game like Flashback or Out of This World, then you should be able to handle what you're getting into here, as Nosferatu is definitely doing its best to ape those classic games as far as controls are concerned. Your character moves at a slower, more plodding pace, and every action you do in the game seems like it requires planning before you execute it, as even just basic movement can feel delayed due to the animation going through its paces. But that's kinda by design. It may not be ideal, but at least fans of something like Prince of Persia should be running and jumping around in Nosferatu without too many issues soon enough. But even once you do get the movement of your character down, you'll still need to wrestle with the game's awkward attempt at hand-to-hand fighting as your only means to deal with the monsters coming at you. And this is where things start to get rough. Pressing the attack button puts you into a fighting stance, where you can then use a variety of button combinations to pull off an assortment of moves and combos. This is fine in theory, but combine this with Nosferatu's already sluggish style of gameplay, and fighting enemies can be a truly awkward experience, with the game just not being able to register button combos as fast as you need to input them. As you can imagine, this leads to a ton of missed attacks, or just doing things like dashing through an enemy when you simply wanted to move forward a little bit. It also doesn't help that several enemies in each stage rush at you, not giving you enough time to even get into your fighting stance before you're knocked over or down into a pit filled with spikes again. Most of the time, it's simply best to avoid enemies if possible, just so you don't have to deal with the combat, and that's never a good thing to say about a game like this. You can eventually sort of get the hang of it by simply using as few attacks as possible so that the game doesn't get confused as easy, but it never feels like you have the control over your character that you need for this type of combat. Castlevania, this definitely isn't. So don't go into Nosferatu expecting a fun knockoff of everyone's favorite vampire slaying game. While Nosferatu may not nail the controls of classic adventure platformers, it thankfully gets the level design right though, making for a surprisingly fun game to make your way through if you can deal with the controls. Each stage offers large areas that are filled with traps, treasures, and puzzles, with the level design feeling like it's lifted almost directly from Prince of Persia. Most of these levels are fairly labyrinthine in design, with multiple paths through them that can either lead to deadly dead ends, or treasure filled with gems that can boost the stage time, refill your health, or make you stronger depending on what color gems the chest contains. All of those things are definitely in short supply, so it makes exploring these levels for treasure chests actually worth your time, especially the power gems, since they alone can make dealing with enemies far easier, since you won't have to wrestle with the combat as much. And just as you'd expect from a game of this type, the difficulty can be way over the top, with every stage bringing it with one-hit kills, cheap hits from enemies, and enough spike-filled pits to make you rip your armchair off. There's definitely a lot of trial and error here, but it's generally the fun kind of trial and error, and makes for an awesome atmosphere of near non-stop dread and danger, which is perfect for the horror-style setting here. If you can manage to make your way to the end of the stage before rage quitting, you'll get a quick side-scrolling stage where you fight the boss, which you're probably already expecting to be a dumpster fire thanks to those controls. But it's actually not so bad, since the game at least gives you plenty of room to maneuver during these boss fights. But even then, it can still be kinda clunky, leading to more than a few deaths simply because you couldn't move out of the way fast enough instead of any real difficulty. If you haven't figured it out by now, then you kinda have to be a glutton for punishment to make your way through Nosferatu. But for those willing to stick with it, you'll find a rewarding time, unlike just about any game on the system. I know we cover a lot of games that come out late in a console's lifespan on this channel, but those are some of the most interesting games to look at for me, since a good majority of people never even got to play these games when they were originally released. Most of us had moved on to whatever the newest console was, and simply didn't even look for new releases on those dusty old consoles that we had already tossed into the closet. Sadly, that meant that a lot of really neat games were never even noticed or long forgotten, and Nosferatu here is a perfect example of just such a game. It received almost zero magazine coverage, no advertising whatsoever that I know of, and came out right smack in the middle of the launch of the PlayStation, which just also happened to be one of the biggest gaming launches of all time. So of course, Nosferatu had no chance of getting anyone's attention, even if it had somehow been the best game ever, which it most certainly is not. But that doesn't mean it's not worth checking out, because I genuinely think it's a pretty good adventure-style platforming game. Yes, the controls are sluggish and finicky, and the difficulty and cheap deaths are off the charts at times, but there's still a great sense of atmosphere thanks to the awesome graphics and animation, along with a lot of fun exploration-style gameplay that only a handful of games on the Super NES ever attempted. Nosferatu is definitely a callback to classic adventure platformers, so if you come into this game expecting fast-paced Castlevania-style action, then you'll be throwing your controller within minutes. But if you can stick with it and learn to master those controls as best you can, then Nosferatu is definitely one of the best obscure Super NES games to sink your teeth into this Halloween.